The lone figure of Yancy Keller stood silently against the fading sunset of 1875, his weathered face reflecting the harsh years of cattle drives and range wars that had carved deep lines into his once smooth features. But it wasn't the West Texas sun that had aged him beyond his 34 years. It was the crushing weight of grief that had settled upon his shoulders like a heavy winter coat in the sweltering August heat. In his trembling hands, he clutched a carefully folded piece of parchment, the cream-colored paper already showing signs of wear along its edges from the countless times he'd opened and closed it since finding it tucked beneath his wife's pillow. Zadie Keller had always been meticulous, even in her final act of love. The wind whispered through the tall prairie grass surrounding their modest homestead 10 miles outside of Austin, Texas. 6 months had passed since Zadie had drawn her last breath, taken by the consumption that had ravaged her once vibrant body, leaving her a hollow shell of the woman who'd followed him westward with dreams bright as Texas stars. Yancy hadn't been able to read her final words. Not then. His hands had shaken too violently when he'd tried, his vision blurred by tears he'd refused to shed in front of the doctor and the neighbors who'd come to help with the burial. Zadie, knowing her husband better than he knew himself, had folded the letter precisely, creating crisp, straight edges that even his trembling fingers could manage, but he couldn't bring himself to unfold it. Not for 6 long, empty months until today. Until the ranch was finally ready to be sold, the cattle gone, and the emptiness of the house too much to bear. He needed her words now, needed her guidance as he prepared to leave the dream they'd built together. With a deep breath that caught painfully in his chest, Yancy unfolded the letter and began to read the elegant script of the woman who'd stolen his heart 8 years before. My dearest Yancy, if you're reading these words, then I have already gone to my rest, and you are alone with your grief and our memories. My love, I need you to know that the years we shared were the greatest blessing God could have bestowed upon me. From that first day when you tipped your hat to me outside the general store in Abilene to our final moments together, I have cherished every sunrise we witnessed and every hardship we overcame side by side. But I cannot bear the thought of you withering away in this empty house, haunted by what once was and what might have been. You must live, my darling, not just exist, but truly live. There is one thing I never told you, something I've kept buried in my heart these many years. Before we met, before I came west with my father, there was another life I left behind in St. Louis. I had a sister, my twin, Zoey. We were separated when our mother died and father could only afford to bring one of us west with him. He chose me, and Zoey was taken in by our mother's sister. We wrote letters for years, but when I married you and we moved to establish our ranch, the correspondence became difficult to maintain. The last letter I received from her was 3 years ago, postmarked from a small town called Silver Creek, just north of San Antonio. My dying wish, my love, is for you to find her. She is alone now too, her husband lost in that terrible mining accident she wrote about. She has a young son who has never met his family. Find her, Yancy, not just for her sake, but for yours. Perhaps in finding the only family I have left, you might also find your way back to living again. I release you from any obligation to me. Love again, Yancy. Your heart is too good to die with me. Forever yours, Zadie. The letter slipped from Yancy's fingers as he stared out at the land that had once held so much promise. A sister. Zadie had a twin sister, and he had a nephew somewhere to the south. Emotions battled within him, anger that she'd kept such a secret, confusion about why she'd never mentioned this family before, and beneath it all, a small, flickering spark he thought had died with Zadie, purpose. Yancy looked toward the setting sun, his decision made before he'd even consciously considered it. Tomorrow he would ride south toward Silver Creek, toward the family he'd never known existed, toward the final request of the woman who, even in death, was trying to save him from himself. The night air was cool against Yancy's face as he gathered his few remaining possessions. The deed to the ranch had been signed over to the banker's son that afternoon, a young man eager to start his own cattle operation with his new bride. Seeing their excitement had been like looking back through time, witnessing his own beginnings with Zadie. As he packed his saddlebags, Yancy's eyes fell upon the small daguerreotype of his wife on their wedding day, her smile radiant and eyes full of promise. He tucked it carefully between pages of his Bible along with her letter, now refolded along its original creases. "I'm doing what you asked, Zadie," he whispered to the empty room. "God help me, I don't know if I can find her after all this time, but I'll try." Dawn broke clear and bright as Yancy mounted his faithful buckskin gelding, Copper. The horse seemed to sense his rider's determination, prancing sideways with anticipation as Yancy took one last look at the homestead that had been the center of his world for nearly a decade. The journey to Silver Creek would take several days, following the trails south toward San Antonio before branching west into the hills. Yancy had studied his maps carefully the night before, marking the fastest route while avoiding the territories known to be frequented by bandits and renegade Comanche bands that still occasionally raided isolated settlements. The first day passed uneventfully, the familiar Texas landscape rolling past as Copper ate up the miles with his steady gait. Yancy made camp by a small creek as the sun began to set, the routine of setting up a solitary camp site as familiar to him as breathing. He'd spent countless nights under the stars during cattle drives before he and Zadie had established their ranch. But those nights had been different, filled with the sounds of lowing cattle, the quiet conversations of fellow cowboys, and the knowledge that each day brought him closer to returning home to Zadie. Now, there was only silence and the endless expanse of stars overhead. The second day brought clouds and the threat of rain, but Yancy pushed on, stopping only when necessary to rest his horse or to consult his map. By late afternoon, the skies had opened, forcing him to seek shelter in a small cave tucked into the side of a rocky outcropping. As he built a small fire to dry his clothes and warm his chilled body, Yancy found himself thinking about the woman he was seeking. What would Zoey be like? Would she resemble Zadie so strongly that seeing her would reopen the wound of his loss? Or would there be subtle differences that would make her a stranger wearing his wife's face? And what of the boy, his nephew? How old would he be now? Zadie's letter had mentioned a young son 3 years ago. A child without a father, being raised by a widowed mother in these harsh lands. Sleep came fitfully that night, haunted by dreams of Zadie's final days, her once robust frame withered by illness. Her breath labored, yet her spirit unbroken as she extracted his promise to carry on after she was gone. A promise he had failed to keep until now. The morning of the third day dawned clear again, and Yancy resumed his journey with renewed determination. By mid-afternoon, he had reached a well-traveled road leading toward San Antonio, and for the first time in days, he encountered other travelers, a family in a wagon headed north. A pair of cowboys driving a small herd of cattle, a traveling salesman whose wagon proclaimed miraculous cures for ailments from rheumatism to female hysteria. It was from this last individual, a garrulous man named Elias Palmer, that Yancy first learned troubling news about his destination. "Silver Creek, you say?" Palmer scratched at his beard thoughtfully as they shared coffee by the roadside. "Ain't much left of that place these days, I'm afraid. Silver ran out about 2 years back and most folks moved on. There's still a handful of families, mostly ranchers who established themselves on the surrounding land, but the town itself is nearly a ghost." Yancy felt a cold sensation settle in his stomach. "Do you know the names of any families that might still be there?" "I'm looking for a woman named Zoey. She'd be a widow with a young son." Palmer's eyes narrowed slightly. "You sure you ain't some kind of debt collector or lawman?" "Folk round here are suspicious of strangers asking after specific people." "No," Yancy assured him quickly. "Nothing like that. She's family, my wife's sister. I only recently learned of her existence and I'm trying to find her." Something in Yancy's expression must have convinced the salesman of his sincerity, for his face softened. "Well, I can't say I know every soul left in that area, but there was a widow woman living on the north edge of town last time I passed through. Can't recall her name, but she had a boy of 8 or 9. kept to herself mostly, but made the finest pies you ever tasted for the church socials. It wasn't much to go on, but it was the first confirmation that Yancy might be on the right track. He thanked Palmer and continued south with renewed urgency, pushing Copper harder than before. Late on the fourth day, as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, Yancy crested a hill and saw Silver Creek spread out below him in the valley. Even from a distance, he could see that Palmer's description had been accurate. Many of the buildings stood abandoned, their windows dark and doors hanging open. But there were signs of life, too, smoke rising from chimneys of some homes. A few horses tethered outside what appeared to be a saloon, laundry flapping on a clothesline behind one of the more well-maintained houses. Yancy urged Copper down the slope toward the town, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. After nearly a week of travel, he was finally here, yet he had no real plan for how to find Zoey in a town where he knew no one and had only the vaguest description to go on. As he rode down what had once been the main street, Yancy noted the empty storefronts, the weathered sign of the assayer's office now faded and peeling, the once grand hotel with half its windows boarded up. A few curious faces peered out at him from the remaining businesses, the saloon, a small general store, and what appeared to be a combination post office and telegraph office. It was to this last establishment that Yancy directed Copper, reasoning that if anyone would know the whereabouts of a widow and her son, it would be the person handling the town's mail and communications. The interior of the post office was dim and musty, with rows of cubbyholes lining one wall and a counter separating the public area from the postmaster's workspace. A bell jingled as Yancy entered, and a moment later, a thin man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose emerged from a back room. "Help you, stranger?" The man asked, eyeing Yancy with the cautious reserve of someone who had seen too many towns boom and bust to be easily impressed by newcomers. "I hope so," Yancy replied, removing his hat. "I'm looking for a woman who might be living hereabouts, a widow with a young son." "Her name would be Zoey. I don't know her married name, I'm afraid." The postmaster's expression didn't change. "Might be I know who you're talking about, might not. What's your business with her?" Yancy hesitated, then decided that the truth was his best option. "She's my late wife's sister. My wife passed 6 months ago, and I only recently discovered that she had a twin. I'm trying to fulfill my wife's dying wish that I find her sister." The postmaster studied him for a long moment, then his face softened slightly. "Sorry for your loss, Mr. Keller, Yancy Keller." "Walter Jenkins," the postmaster replied with a nod. "And you say this woman is your wife's twin? That would make her Zoey Darrow, I reckon. Lives in a small cabin about a mile north of town with her boy, Thomas. Been here about 5 years now, since before the mine played out." Relief washed over Yancy. "Darrow," he repeated, committing the name to memory. Is she well, the boy too?" Jenkins shrugged. "Far as I know, they keep to themselves mostly. She makes her living baking for folks around town and taking in sewing. The boy helps old Doc Miller sometimes, running errands and such. They're getting by, I suppose, but it ain't been easy for them since Darrow died in that cave-in." "Can you direct me to their cabin?" Yancy asked, eager now that his goal was so close. Jenkins gave him precise directions, then added, "You might want to wait till morning, though. Trail can be tricky in the dark, and Mrs. Darrow ain't likely to welcome strangers appearing on her doorstep after nightfall." Yancy nodded, acknowledging the wisdom of this advice despite his impatience. "Is there somewhere in town I can get a room for the night? The hotel's closed up, but Sally over at the saloon rents rooms upstairs. They're clean enough, and she serves a decent stew." With a word of thanks, Yancy left the post office and led Copper down the street to the saloon, his mind whirling with thoughts of what tomorrow might bring. After all this time, after the long journey, he would finally meet Zoey Darrow, the woman who, without knowing it, represented his last connection to Zadie, and perhaps his only chance at fulfilling his promise to truly live again. The saloon, named simply Sally's Place, was a far cry from the rowdy establishments Yancy had known in his younger days. A handful of local men sat at tables nursing glasses of whiskey or beer, while a plump, middle-aged woman with graying auburn hair pulled back in a severe bun stood behind the bar, wiping glasses with a clean cloth. She looked up as Yancy entered, her shrewd eyes taking in his travel-worn appearance with a practiced glance. "Evening, stranger. What can I do for you?" "I'm looking for a room for the night," Yancy replied, approaching the bar. "And a hot meal, if that's possible." "Walter Jenkins at the post office sent me your way." The woman Sally, he presumed, nodded. "Got 2 rooms available upstairs. 50 cents gets you the room and breakfast. Stew's extra, but it comes with biscuits." "Sounds fair," Yancy said, reaching into his pocket for the coins. As he placed them on the bar, he added, "I'm Yancy Keller, madam, just arrived from Austin." "Sally Winters," she confirmed, scooping up the money. "Long ride from Austin. What brings you to what's left of Silver Creek?" Before Yancy could respond, one of the men at a nearby table spoke up. "He was asking after the Darrow widow at the post office. Jenkins told me when I picked up my mail." Sally's eyebrows rose slightly as she turned her attention back to Yancy, who felt a flicker of irritation at the speed with which his business had become common knowledge. Small towns and their gossip, some things never changed, no matter where you went. "I'm looking for Mrs. Darrow, yes," he acknowledged. "She's family, my late wife's sister." Something in Sally's expression softened. "You'd be Zadie's husband then," she said, surprising Yancy. Zoey mentioned her sister married a rancher near Austin, said she hadn't heard from her in some time, though. Yancy swallowed hard, the unexpected connection momentarily robbing him of words. "You know Zoey well," Sally shrugged. "As well as anyone around here, I suppose. She bakes the pies I serve on Sundays best in the county, and I look after young Tommy sometimes when she has to travel to San Antonio for supplies." She studied Yancy's face. "She'll be mighty surprised to see you, especially if you're bringing news of her sister's passing." The reminder of his grim news dampened Yancy's spirits. In his determination to find Zoey, he had somehow managed to push aside the fact that he would be the bearer of devastating tidings. How would she react? Would she blame him for not reaching out sooner, for allowing Zadie to slip away without a final reunion with her twin? "I'll have that stew now," he said quietly, not wanting to discuss the matter further in front of curious ears. "And if you could point me to my room, I'd be obliged." Sally nodded, understanding his reticence. She served him a bowl of hearty beef stew with 2 large golden brown biscuits, then directed him to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor. As Yancy ate his meal in the relative privacy of his room, he found himself staring at the daguerreotype of Zadie, searching her beloved features for hints of the twin he would meet tomorrow. Would they be identical? Zadie had never mentioned any distinguishing marks or differences. The thought of looking into a face so like his wife's both terrified and fascinated him. Would it be like seeing a ghost, or would Zoey be distinct enough that he could separate her in his mind from the woman he had lost? Sleep came reluctantly that night, and Yancy rose with the dawn, eager to complete his journey. After a breakfast of eggs and more of Sally's excellent biscuits, he settled his bill and retrieved Copper from the livery where the horse had spent a comfortable night. "You tell Zoey that Sally says it's time she came to town again," the saloon keeper called as Yancy mounted up. "Been too long since she brought those pies by and folks are asking after them." Yancy tipped his hat in acknowledgement and turned Copper's head north, following the directions Jenkins had given him. The trail was easy enough to follow in daylight, a narrow but well-worn path that wound through groves of oak and mesquite trees, before emerging into a small clearing where a neat cabin stood. It was a modest dwelling, smaller than the home he had shared with Zadie, but well-maintained. A vegetable garden sprawled to one side, its neat rows evidence of careful tending. Chickens scratched in the yard, and a milk cow dozed in the shade of a large oak tree. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and as Yancy drew closer, he could see washing hanging on a line behind the cabin, fluttering in the morning breeze. He dismounted at a respectful distance and led Copper the rest of the way, not wanting to alarm the cabin's occupants by riding in too aggressively. His heart hammered against his ribs as he approached the front door, rehearsing in his mind the words he would say to this woman, who was both stranger and family. Before he could knock, the door swung open, and Yancy found himself facing the business end of a shotgun held in the steady hands of a woman whose face made his heart stop, Zadie's face. But not Zadie. The resemblance was uncanny, the same high cheekbones, the same delicate nose, the same shape of the eyes. But where Zadie's eyes had been a warm brown, this woman's were a striking green. Her hair, pulled back in a practical braid, was a shade darker than Zadie's had been, and a small scar marked her left temple. "State your business," she said, her voice cool and controlled, but with an undercurrent of wariness that spoke of hard lessons learned. "We don't get many visitors out here, especially not well-dressed cowboys leading expensive horses." Yancy raised his hands slowly to show he meant no harm. "Mrs. Darrow, Zoey Darrow," her eyes narrowed slightly, but she gave a curt nod. "My name is Yancy Keller," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. I was married to your sister, Zadie." The shotgun wavered almost imperceptibly, and Yancy saw a flash of something recognition, perhaps, or shock cross her face before she schooled her features back to caution. "Prove it," she demanded. Yancy slowly lowered one hand to reach into his pocket, telegraphing his movements clearly. "I have a letter from her," he said, withdrawing the carefully folded piece of parchment, "and a photograph." Zoey studied him for a long moment, then lowered the shotgun slightly, not completely, but enough to signal a willingness to listen. "Show me." He extended the letter first, and she took it with her free hand, the shotgun still half raised in the other. As she unfolded it and recognized her sister's handwriting, her composure cracked. The shotgun lowered further as her eyes scanned the words, and when she looked up at Yancy again, there was moisture gathering in those green eyes, so unlike yet so like Zadie's. "She's gone, isn't she?" Zoey asked softly, though it wasn't really a question. "That's why you're here. That's why she wrote this." Yancy nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Zoey closed her eyes briefly, her face a mask of grief so familiar that it was like looking into a mirror of his own pain 6 months ago. When she opened them again, there was a new resolve in her expression. "You'd better come inside, Mr. Keller," she said, stepping back from the doorway. "We have much to discuss, it seems." As Yancy followed Zoey into the cabin, he couldn't help but feel that he had crossed an invisible threshold, not just from outside to inside, but from his old life to whatever awaited him now, in the aftermath of fulfilling Zadie's final request. The interior of the cabin was simple but comfortable, with a main room that served as both kitchen and living area, and what appeared to be 2 small bedrooms beyond a curtained doorway. Everything was meticulously clean and organized, from the dishes stacked neatly on open shelves to the precisely arranged collection of books on a small table near the stone fireplace. "Please sit," Zoey said, gesturing to one of the wooden chairs at the small dining table as she propped the shotgun against the wall still within reach. Yancy noted, but no longer an immediate threat. "Would you like coffee? It's fresh." "Thank you," Yancy accepted, removing his hat and placing it on the table before him. As Zoey moved to the cast iron stove to pour the coffee, he found himself studying her, noting the similarities and differences between this woman and his wife. They shared the same graceful movements, the same way of tilting their heads when concentrating. But where Zadie had always seemed to radiate warmth, Zoey projected a kind of guarded strength. She returned with 2 mugs of steaming coffee, setting one before him before taking the seat across the table. For a moment neither spoke, both seemingly unsure how to begin this conversation laden with grief and unanswered questions. "When?" Zoey finally asked, her hands wrapped around her mug as if seeking its warmth despite the mild temperature of the spring morning. 6 months ago," Yancy replied quietly. "Consumption. The doctor said there was nothing to be done by the time we realized how serious it was." Zoey nodded, her gaze distant. "I felt it," she said softly. Not the specifics, but I knew something was wrong. Twins sometimes do, they say." She focused on Yancy again. "She never told you about me." The question held no accusation, only a sad curiosity, but Yancy still felt a pang of guilt. No, not until the letter. I found it after she was gone. She'd left it for me, knowing I would need time before I could read it. That sounds like Zadie, Zoey said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips, always thinking of others, even at the end. She paused, taking a sip of her coffee. And you came all this way just because she asked you to find me? She was right, Yancy admitted. I wasn't living after she died. Just existing, this journey, it gave me purpose again. Zoey studied him over the rim of her mug, her green eyes seeming to look directly into his soul. And now that you've found me, what comes next, Mr. Keller? Before Yancy could respond, the sound of running footsteps approached the cabin, and the door burst open to admit a boy of about 10, his dark hair windblown and his clothes bearing the evidence of outdoor play. Ma. You won't believe what I found down by the boy skidded to a halt as he noticed Yancy, his expression instantly shifting from excitement to wariness. Who's this? He asked, moving instinctively to his mother's side. Thomas, this is Mr. Keller, Zoey said, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. He was your Aunt Zadie's husband. The boy's eyes widened. The aunt from your stories, the one who went to Austin, Zoey nodded, and Thomas turned to study Yancy with undisguised curiosity. Are you really a cowboy? Do you have a herd of cattle? Ma says Aunt Zadie married a cowboy who became a rancher. Despite the solemnity of the moment, Yancy couldn't help but smile at the boy's enthusiasm. I was both at different times, he confirmed, though I've sold my ranch and cattle now. Thomas, Zoey interrupted gently, why don't you go wash up and then see to Mr. Keller's horse? I'm sure it could use some water and grain after the journey. The boy looked as if he wanted to protest clearly. He had more questions for this unexpected visitor, but a look from his mother sent him obediently back outside, though not without a final curious glance at Yancy. He's a fine boy, Yancy observed when Thomas had gone. He has Zadie's curiosity. And her stubbornness, Zoey added with a small smile. He's all I have left of James, my husband, and now, it seems, all I have left of my sister as well. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of shared loss hanging between them. Finally, Zoey spoke again, her voice steadier now. You still haven't answered my question, Mr. Keller. What comes next? You fulfilled Zadie's request. You found me. Will you return to Austin now? Yancy looked down at his coffee, considering his response carefully. The truth was, he hadn't thought much beyond finding Zoey. The journey itself had consumed his focus, and now that he was here, faced with this living reminder of what he had lost, he found himself at a crossroads. I don't know, he admitted finally. There's nothing for me in Austin anymore. I sold everything before I left. He met her gaze directly. But I don't want to intrude on your life here, either. Perhaps I could stay in town for a few days and we could get to know each other, for Zadie's sake. Zoey seemed to weigh this suggestion, her expression unreadable. There's an abandoned homestead about half a mile east of here, she said after a moment. The Millers left when the mine closed. The cabin is still sound, though it would need some cleaning. You could stay there if you wanted something more private than Sally's rooms. Yancy recognized the offer for what it was, not quite an invitation to stay with them, but a compromise that would keep him close enough to begin building whatever relationship might be possible between them. That's very generous, he said. I'd be happy to accept. Zoey nodded, then rose from the table. Thomas and I were planning to visit town this afternoon to deliver some pies to Sally. If you'd like to ride along, we can show you the Miller place on the way back. I'd like that, Yancy agreed, finishing his coffee and reaching for his hat. As he stepped back outside to help Thomas with copper, Yancy felt a curious lightening in his chest. The grief was still there, it would always be there, he suspected, but alongside it was something he hadn't felt in months, the tentative stirring of hope. The wagon ride to Silver Creek was filled with Thomas's endless questions about life on a cattle ranch, which Yancy answered patiently, occasionally catching Zoey's amused glance as her son's curiosity continued unabated. The boy's enthusiasm was infectious, and Yancy found himself recounting stories of cattle drives and frontier life that he hadn't thought about in years. Did you ever fight Indians? Thomas asked eagerly, his eyes wide. Thomas, Zoey admonished gently, that's not an appropriate question. It's all right, Yancy assured her. And no, Thomas, I never fought Indians. I've traded with Comanche and Cherokee and once spent 3 days with a Kiowa family when I got caught in a blizzard during a cattle drive. They probably saved my life with their hospitality. The boy looked both disappointed and intrigued by this answer. But what about outlaws? Did you ever shoot an outlaw? This time, Yancy's smile was tinged with sadness. I've had to defend myself and others a few times over the years, he admitted. But taking a life, any life, isn't something to brag about or take lightly. It stays with you. Thomas fell silent, perhaps sensing the seriousness behind Yancy's words. Zoey gave Yancy an approving look before turning her attention back to guiding the wagon into town. Silver Creek looked marginally more alive in the afternoon light, with a few more people visible on the dusty main street. Their arrival caused a minor stir, with several townsfolk calling out greetings to Zoey and Thomas, and curious glances directed at Yancy riding alongside them on Copper. They stopped first at Sally's place, where Zoey delivered a half-dozen fresh baked pies that filled the air with the sweet scent of apples and cinnamon. Sally welcomed them warmly, eyeing Yancy with undisguised curiosity. So you found her, she said to him while Zoey was arranging the pies on the counter. Told you those directions wouldn't lead you astray. Thank you for your help, Yancy replied sincerely. Mrs. Darrow has been very gracious, considering I arrived unannounced with difficult news. Sally nodded sagely. Zoey's got steel in her spine, that one. Had to, raising a boy alone in these parts. James was a good man. His death hit everyone hard, but especially her. She lowered her voice. She'll need time to process her sister's passing. Twins have a special bond, they say. Before Yancy could respond, Zoey rejoined them, Thomas at her heels. We'll be stopping at the general store next, she informed Yancy. Then I need to see Doc Miller about some herbs for my garden. You're welcome to join us, or if you'd prefer to wait here, Sally serves the best whiskey in the county. I'll come along, Yancy decided, not wanting to cut short his time with them. The next hour passed pleasantly as they completed their errands, with Yancy carrying packages and listening to the easy banter between Zoey and the townsfolk. It was clear that despite her reputation for keeping to herself, she was well respected in Silver Creek. Several people expressed surprise upon learning of his connection to her, and Yancy could see the news of Zadie's death and his arrival spreading through the small community like ripples in a pond. As they prepared to leave town, Thomas asked if he could ride back with Yancy on Copper instead of in the wagon. Zoey hesitated, looking to Yancy with a question in her eyes. If it's all right with your mother, Yancy said, I'd be honored to have you ride with me. After extracting a promise from Thomas to hold on tight and behave, Zoey gave her permission, and soon they were making their way back toward the Darrow cabin. Thomas perched in front of Yancy on the saddle, chattering excitedly about how high up everything looked from horseback. We'll take the east fork in the road here, Zoey called from the wagon as they approached a split in the path. The Miller place is just beyond those trees. The abandoned homestead was much as Zoey had described, a small but solidly built cabin with a stone chimney, set in a clearing surrounded by oak trees. The structure appeared sound, though weeds had begun to reclaim the yard, and the door hung slightly askew on its hinges. It needs work, Zoey acknowledged as they dismounted to inspect it more closely, but the roof doesn't leak and the fireplace draws well. The Millers were good builders. Yancy walked around the cabin, assessing its condition with a practiced eye. It was smaller than his home with Zadie had been, but larger than Zoey's cabin. With some cleaning and minor repairs, it would be quite comfortable. It's perfect, he said, turning back to Zoey. Thank you for suggesting it. She nodded, a hint of uncertainty crossing her face for the first time since their meeting. Thomas and I should head back before it gets too late. Will you be all right here tonight? We could bring you some supplies, blankets, food. I have what I need in my saddlebags, Yancy assured her. And I'm used to roughing it. I'll be fine. Thomas, who had been exploring the perimeter of the cabin, ran back to them. "Can Mr. Keller come for supper?" he asked his mother. "You said we had plenty of stew left from yesterday." Zoey hesitated, then nodded. "If he'd like to, yes." Yancy accepted the invitation gratefully, and after agreeing to join them in an hour, he watched as they continued down the road toward their own home, Thomas waving enthusiastically from the wagon. Alone in the abandoned cabin, Yancy set about making the space habitable. He cleared away cobwebs, swept the wooden floor with a makeshift broom of bundled twigs, and repaired the door hinges as best he could with the limited tools he carried. By the time he needed to leave for supper, the cabin had begun to feel less like an abandoned shell and more like a potential home, temporary though it might be. The evening meal at the Darrow cabin was a simple but delicious affair: venison stew, fresh bread, and wild greens from Zoey's garden. The conversation flowed more easily than Yancy had expected, with Thomas serving as an effective buffer between the adults, his endless questions and observations preventing any awkward silences from taking root. After the meal, as Thomas reluctantly prepared for bed despite his protests that he wasn't tired, Zoey invited Yancy to join her on the small porch. The evening was mild, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers and distant rain. "He likes you," Zoey said as they settled into the two rocking chairs that flanked the porch. "He's never known his father's family, they're all back east, and showed little interest in maintaining contact after James died. And of course, he never met Zadie." "He's a fine boy," Yancy replied. "You've done well with him, especially considering the challenges." Zoey was silent for a moment, rocking gently. "It hasn't been easy," she admitted finally. "When James died, many people expected me to sell up and move back to civilization, perhaps return to St. Louis or go to San Antonio. But this is our home. Thomas was born here, and I've always been stubborn." "Like Zadie," Yancy said with a small smile. "Yes, like Zadie." Zoey's voice softened. "Will you tell me about her life, about your years together?" Her letters were infrequent, especially toward the end. "I knew she was happy, but little else." So Yancy began to talk, haltingly at first, then with growing ease as the memories flowed. He told Zoey about meeting Zadie and Abilene, about their courtship and marriage, about the struggles and joys of establishing their ranch near Austin. He spoke of Zadie's love for growing things, her knack for befriending even the most standoffish neighbors, her quiet strength during the drought of '71 that nearly ruined them. And finally, reluctantly, he spoke of her illness, how it had crept up so gradually that neither of them recognized the danger until it was too late. How bravely she had faced her approaching death, more concerned with his future than her own comfort. "She never complained," Yancy said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not once. Even at the end, when the pain must have been unbearable, she would smile and tell me not to worry, said she was just going ahead to scout the trail for me, like we used to joke about on cattle drives." Zoey's eyes glistened with unshed tears in the fading light. "That sounds like her, always putting others first." She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I felt it, you know, the day she died. I woke up in the middle of the night feeling like half of me had been torn away. I knew something had happened to her, but with no way to confirm it. I've been carrying that uncertainty for 6 months." "I'm sorry," Yancy said, the simple words inadequate for the depth of feeling behind them. "I should have tried to find you sooner." She left the letter, but I couldn't bear to read it at first, and then when I did, I had to make arrangements to sell the ranch, but that's no excuse." "No," Zoey agreed quietly. "It's not an excuse, it's grief. I understand it better than most." They sat in silence for a time, the darkness deepening around them, each lost in memories of the people they had loved and lost. Finally, Zoey spoke again, her voice steadier. "What will you do now, Yancy, now that you've delivered your news and fulfilled Zadie's wish?" It was the first time she had used his given name, and something in the way she said it made his heart beat a little faster. "I don't know," he admitted. "I have no ties anywhere, no family except you and Thomas, I suppose, though I have no claim on either of you." "You were Zadie's husband," Zoey said simply. "That makes you family, whether you have a claim or not." The words warmed something inside Yancy that had been cold for too long. "Then, if you've no objection, I might stay a while, fix up the Miller place." See if there's work to be had in these parts. He hesitated. Get to know my family, Zoey nodded slowly. I think Zadie would approve of that plan. As Yancy rode back to the Miller cabin later that night, the stars spread out above him like diamonds scattered on velvet. He felt a sense of peace that had eluded him since Zadie's death. He was still grieving, would always grieve for her in some measure, but for the first time he could see a path forward. A reason to continue. Zadie had known somehow that in finding her sister, Yancy might also find himself again. It was her final gift to him, folded carefully in a letter she knew his trembling hands would eventually open. The days that followed fell into a pattern that was both comforting and energizing for Yancy. His mornings were spent making repairs and improvements to the Miller cabin, fixing the roof, patching holes in the walls, clearing the overgrown yard. In the afternoons, he often helped Zoey with heavier tasks around her property, chopping wood, mending fences, and once tracking down a mountain lion that had been preying on her chickens. Thomas became his shadow whenever the boy wasn't helping his mother or attending the small school that still operated in town despite Silver Creek's decline. Yancy taught him to ride properly, to track game, to whittle simple figures from wood, all the things a father would teach a son. And in the evenings, the three of them often gathered on Zoey's porch, sharing meals and stories as spring deepened into summer. Word of Yancy's presence spread through the community, and soon he found himself being offered odd jobs by various residents, breaking horses for the livery stable owner, helping the blacksmith with a large order of wagon wheels, even occasionally riding as a scout for the stage line that still passed through Silver Creek once a week. But it was his time with Zoey that affected him most profoundly. At first, her resemblance to Zadie had been almost painful to behold, but as he came to know her better, the differences became more apparent than the similarities. Where Zadie had been gentle and accommodating, Zoey was forthright and occasionally stubborn. Where his wife had been content with their settled life, Zoey had a restless streak, a hunger for news and books and ideas from beyond Silver Creek. And somewhere along the way, without quite realizing when it had happened, Yancy found himself looking at Zoey not as Zadie's twin, but as herself, a woman of strength and complexity who had carved out a life for herself and her son against considerable odds. The realization troubled him. It felt, in some way, like a betrayal of Zadie's memory to see her sister as more than an extension of her, more than a living reminder of what he had lost. Yet Zadie herself had released him from any obligation to her, had encouraged him to love again. Had she somehow known that in finding Zoey he might find not just family, but a second chance at happiness? These thoughts occupied Yancy on a warm July evening as he sat alone on the porch of what he now thought of as his cabin, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. The Miller place was almost unrecognizable now, with a fresh coat of whitewash, new curtains at the windows sewn by Zoey, and a thriving vegetable garden that he and Thomas had planted together. It looked like a home, his home, though something was still missing, a lack he felt most keenly in the quiet evenings like this one. A movement on the road caught his attention, and he straightened as he recognized Zoey walking toward his cabin alone, an unusual occurrence. Usually, Thomas accompanied her on these visits, or they came together in the wagon. She waved when she saw him on the porch, and Yancy raised a hand in return, trying to ignore the quickening of his pulse at the sight of her. She wore a simple blue dress, her dark hair loose around her shoulders rather than in its usual practical braid, and he thought she had never looked lovelier. "Evening," he called as she approached. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," she assured him, climbing the steps to join him on the porch. "Thomas is staying with the doctor's family tonight. He's been helping with some patients, and Doc thinks he might have a talent for medicine." Yancy nodded, pride warming his chest. The boy had shown a keen interest in the doctor's work, and it seemed only natural that he might follow that path. "That's wonderful. He's a smart lad." Zoey settled into the second rocking chair, a recent addition that Yancy had built specifically with her in mind, though he hadn't admitted as much. "I thought I might walk over and see how your garden is faring," she said, though her tone suggested this wasn't the real purpose of her visit. "The beans are coming in nicely," Yancy reported, playing along, "and the tomatoes should be ripe in another week or so." They rocked in companionable silence for a few minutes, watching as the last sliver of sun disappeared behind the distant hills, leaving the sky awash in deepening shades of purple and blue. "I've been thinking," Zoey said finally, her voice quiet but steady, "about Zadie's letter to you. About what she wanted for you." Yancy's heart began to pound harder. "Oh, she loved you very much," Zoey continued, her gaze fixed on the darkening landscape. "Enough to want your happiness even after she was gone. That's a rare kind of love." "Yes," Yancy agreed softly. "She was a rare woman." "We were different, you know," Zoey said, turning to look at him directly now. "People always thought of us as two halves of a whole because we were twins, but we were distinct people with different dreams, different strengths." She paused. "Different hearts." Yancy nodded, not trusting himself to speak as he sensed the conversation moving into territory both desired and feared. "When you first arrived," Zoey went on, "I thought you were seeing Zadie when you looked at me, and perhaps you were at first, but lately—" She hesitated. "Lately, I've wondered if you might be seeing me for myself." The directness of her words, so characteristic of her and so unlike Zadie, sent a thrill through Yancy. "I do," he admitted, "and it frightens me sometimes. It feels like betrayal," Zoey finished for him when he faltered. "I understand. I felt the same way when I realized I was developing feelings for you, as if I were somehow taking something that belonged to my sister." The acknowledgement of feelings hung in the air between them, neither quite ready to reach for it fully. "But then I remembered something," Zoey continued after a moment. "Something our mother used to tell us when we were very young. She said that God gave us two hands so that we could hold onto more than one precious thing at a time." Her voice softened. "I think it's possible to honor Zadie's memory and still allow ourselves to find happiness, Yancy. I think that's exactly what she would want." Yancy reached across the space between their chairs and took Zoey's hand in his. It was different from Zadie's, calloused in different places, the fingers slightly longer, but it fit perfectly in his own. "I've been alone a long time," Zoey whispered, her fingers tightening around his. "Since before James died, really. He was gone so often with the mine." She took a deep breath. "I'm not Zadie, I never will be, but I think we could be good together, you and I, and Thomas adores you." "I adore him too," Yancy said, his voice rough with emotion, "and his mother." He lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I don't want to replace what you had with James or what I had with Zadie. Those loves are part of us always, but maybe we can build something new together, something just as strong, just as true." Zoey's eyes glistened with tears in the fading light, but her smile was radiant. "I'd like that," she said simply. As the first stars began to appear in the twilight sky, Yancy drew Zoey gently from her chair and into his arms. She came willingly, fitting against him as if they had been crafted for each other. When he lowered his lips to hers, the kiss was both an ending and a beginning of farewell to the solitary grief they had each carried, and a promise of the joy they might find together. Later, as they walked hand in hand back toward Zoey's cabin in the deepening night, Yancy felt a profound sense of rightness settle over him. Zadie had somehow known that in finding her sister, he would find not just family, but a future. Her final gift to him had been this chance at a new life, a new love. And in the quiet corners of his heart, he could almost hear her approval in the rustling of the leaves overhead. The summer passed in a golden haze of contentment for Yancy, Zoey, and Thomas. Their lives intertwined more with each passing day, and by August, Yancy was spending more nights at the Darrow cabin than at his own. The town took note of the developing relationship with the quiet approval of a community that had witnessed too much hardship not to celebrate happiness when it appeared in their midst. It was Thomas who first suggested that Yancy should just stay forever, his directness bringing smiles to both adults' faces over breakfast one morning. But the boy's words planted a seed that took root and grew in Yancy's mind over the following weeks. He began making plans quietly, consulting with Doc Miller about the legalities of marriage in their county, commissioning a special piece from the blacksmith, and even writing a letter to the bank in Austin where he had deposited the proceeds from the sale of his ranch. By early September, everything was in place. On a crisp, clear morning, Yancy asked Zoey to accompany him on a ride to a scenic overlook a few miles from their cabins, a spot Thomas had shown him where wildflowers carpeted a hillside, and the view stretched for miles across the rolling Texas landscape. "It's beautiful," Zoey breathed as they dismounted near the edge of the hill. "I can see why Thomas loves this place. He has good taste," Yancy agreed, taking her hand as they walked toward a flat rock that formed a natural bench overlooking the valley below. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, enjoying the view and the gentle breeze that carried the scent of late summer flowers. Finally, Yancy turned to face Zoey, taking both her hands in his. "I've been thinking," he began, his heart racing despite the careful preparation of his words, "about what Thomas said, about me staying forever." A soft smile curved Zoey's lips. "Have you now?" "I have," Yancy confirmed, drawing a deep breath. "Zoey, when I came to Silver Creek, I was a broken man fulfilling a promise to a woman I had loved with all my heart. I never expected to find a new purpose, a new family, a new love." Her green eyes shimmered with emotion as she squeezed his hands encouragingly. "I know it hasn't been very long," Yancy continued, "and if you think we should wait, I'll respect that. But I also know that life is uncertain and precious, and I don't want to waste a single day that could be spent as your husband." Reaching into his pocket, he withdrew a ring, a simple band of silver worked into an intricate pattern of intertwined vines, with a small, perfect emerald set at its center. "This is new," he said, holding it up so the sunlight caught the stone, making it glow the exact shade of her eyes. "But the love I feel for you, while also new, is as real and true as anything I've ever known." Zoey's breath caught as she looked from the ring to his face. "Yancy, I'm not asking you to forget James, just as I will never forget Zadie," he said earnestly. "But I believe there's room in our hearts for the memory of those we've lost and the love we've found. Zoey Darrow, will you marry me? Will you and Thomas make a new family with me?" For a heartbeat, Zoey was still, her expression unreadable. Then with a soft cry, she threw her arms around Yancy's neck, nearly knocking him backward off their stone seat. "Yes," she whispered against his ear, her voice thick with emotion. "Oh, Yancy, yes." When she pulled back, her face was radiant with joy despite the tears that tracked down her cheeks. Yancy gently wiped them away with his thumb before slipping the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as he had known it would. "Thomas will be ecstatic," Zoey said, admiring the ring. "He's been dropping hints for weeks." Yancy laughed. "I know, he's not as subtle as he thinks, in fact." He turned slightly in his seat, raising his voice. "You can come out now, Thomas." There was a rustling from a clump of bushes about 20 yards away, and Thomas emerged, his face split in a wide grin. "Did she say yes?" he called, barely containing his excitement. "Come see for yourself," Zoey replied, holding up her hand to display the ring. The boy whooped with delight and ran to join them, launching himself into a three-way hug that nearly sent all of them tumbling down the hillside. "I knew you'd say yes," Thomas said smugly as they regained their balance. "Yancy asked me for permission last week, and I told him you'd been sighing over him like a character in one of those romance novels you think I don't know you read." "Thomas." Zoey exclaimed, her cheeks flushing pink as Yancy laughed. "Well, it's true," the boy insisted, "and I told him it was high time he made an honest woman of you, just like Mr. Jenkins said at the post office." Zoey groaned, covering her face with her hands. "Is the entire town in on this proposal?" "Pretty much," Yancy admitted with a grin. "Sally's planning a celebration for tonight. Doc Miller's bringing his fiddle. The whole town wants to celebrate with us if that's all right with you." Zoey's expression softened as she looked from Yancy to her son and back again. "Of course it's all right, more than all right." She leaned forward to kiss Yancy gently on the lips, ignoring Thomas's exaggerated sound of disgust. "It's perfect. Everything is perfect." As they rode back toward town, Thomas chattering excitedly between them about the plans for the celebration and the wedding. Yancy felt a sense of completion that he had never expected to experience again after Zadie's death. The grief was still there, would always be there in some measure, but it had been transformed, integrated into a larger tapestry of emotion that included joy, hope, and profound gratitude. That evening, as the residents of Silver Creek gathered in Sally's saloon to celebrate their engagement with music, dancing, and more of Sally's whiskey than was perhaps strictly necessary, Yancy found a quiet moment to step outside onto the porch. The night was clear, the stars brilliant against the dark velvet of the sky. He reached into his pocket and withdrew Zadie's letter, worn now from countless readings, but still legible, still precious. As he had done many times before, he unfolded it carefully and read the final paragraph. "I release you from any obligation to me. Love again, Yancy. Your heart is too good to die with me." "I did it, Zadie," he whispered to the stars. "I found her. And somehow, against all odds, I found myself again too." A soft touch on his arm made him turn. Zoey stood beside him, her face glowing in the light spilling from the saloon windows, her eyes understanding as she saw the letter in his hands. "Everything all right?" she asked gently. Yancy nodded, carefully refolding the letter and returning it to his pocket. "Everything is perfect," he said, echoing her words from earlier. He drew her into his arms, breathing in the scent of her hair lavender, where Zadie's had been rose, and marveling at how the heart could expand to hold so much love, past and present intertwined like the vines on the ring he had given her. "Come inside," Zoey murmured against his chest. "Our family is waiting." Hand in hand, they returned to the warmth and light of the celebration, to the community that had embraced them, and to the future they would build together, a future made possible by a letter carefully folded by loving hands for trembling fingers to open when the time was right. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning, with the hills around Silver Creek ablaze in autumn colors. The entire town turned out for the occasion, filling the small church to capacity and spilling into the churchyard. Sally had outdone herself with decorations, transforming the simple building into a bower of wildflowers and ribbons. Doc Miller played his fiddle for the processional, the sweet notes carrying on the clear air as Zoey walked down the aisle on Thomas's proudly extended arm. Yancy, waiting at the altar in a new suit ordered specially from San Antonio, felt his breath catch at the sight of his bride. Zoey wore a gown of pale blue silk, not white, as they had both agreed that this second marriage for each of them should acknowledge rather than erase their pasts. Her dark hair was adorned with small white flowers, and she carried a bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers gathered by Thomas that morning. The ceremony was simple but deeply moving, with both Yancy and Zoey speaking vows they had written themselves. Thomas stood beside them, officially serving as ring bearer but participating in the ceremony in a more meaningful way when the minister asked him if he accepted Yancy as his new father. "I've been calling him Pa in my head for months already," the boy declared, bringing laughter and a few tears from the assembled guests. The celebration afterward lasted well into the night, with tables set up in the town square, music provided by a rotating cast of local musicians, and enough food to feed twice the population of Silver Creek. As darkness fell, lanterns were lit, casting a warm glow over the festivities. "Mrs. Keller," Yancy murmured as he and Zoey danced slowly to a waltz being played by Doc Miller. "How does it sound?" "Wonderful," Zoey replied, her eyes shining as she looked up at him, "though I think it might take me a while to get used to answering to it." "We have time," Yancy assured her, drawing her closer. "All the time in the world." Later that night, as they stood on the porch of what was now truly their home, they had decided to live primarily at Zoey's cabin while maintaining the Miller place as a workshop and potential future expansion. As their family grew, Yancy found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. "What are you thinking?" Zoey asked, leaning against him as they gazed up at the star-filled sky. "I was thinking about how life takes us on unexpected trails," Yancy replied, his arm tightening around her. A year ago, I couldn't imagine feeling happiness again. 6 months ago, I didn't even know you existed, and now—" He turned to face her, cupping her cheek gently. "Now I can't imagine my life without you and Thomas." Zoey leaned into his touch. "I believe Zadie knew exactly what she was doing when she wrote that letter. She knew that in finding me, you might find healing. And perhaps she knew that I needed you too, that Thomas needed a father, and I needed a partner." She smiled softly. She was always the wiser twin, though I'd have denied it fiercely when we were young. "I think you're both wise in different ways," Yancy said, kissing her gently. "And I'm grateful every day that she led me to you." As winter settled over Silver Creek, bringing crisp, cold days and long, cozy nights, the new Keller family fell into comfortable routines. Yancy took on more regular work with the stage line, serving as a guard on the run between Silver Creek and San Antonio. The position allowed him to be home most nights while bringing in a steady income to supplement what Zoey earned from her baking and sewing. Thomas continued to assist Doc Miller whenever possible, his interest in medicine growing stronger with each passing month. The doctor had begun teaching him to read Latin, the first step toward formal medical training if the boy chose to pursue it. Christmas that year was especially joyous, their first as a family, with Thomas nearly bursting with excitement as he helped decorate their cabin with pine boughs and ribbons. Yancy had ridden to San Antonio on his last stage run before the holiday and returned with presents for both Zoey and Thomas, as well as supplies for a feast that would rival any in Silver Creek. On Christmas Eve, after Thomas had finally been persuaded to go to bed, though he protested that at 11 he was far too old for Santa Claus, Yancy and Zoey sat before the fire, enjoying the quiet and each other's company. "I have something for you," Zoey said softly, reaching behind the sofa cushion to withdraw a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a red ribbon. "I wanted to give it to you privately." Curious, Yancy unwrapped the package to find a small, leather-bound book. Opening it, he discovered that it was a journal, the pages filled with Zoey's neat handwriting. "It's everything I can remember about growing up with Zadie," Zoey explained as he turned the pages with gentle fingers. "Our childhood in St. Louis, the games we played, the dreams we shared. The day we were separated and the letters we exchanged afterward." She touched his hand. "I thought you might want to know her in a way that even you, as her husband, couldn't have, the Zadie from before." Yancy felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes as he carefully closed the journal. "This is the most precious gift anyone has ever given me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you, Zoey. Thank you for sharing her with me in this way." Zoey's own eyes were damp as she leaned forward to kiss him. "We both loved her in different ways. She's part of what brought us together. I think it's right that we honor that, even as we build our own story." As they held each other before the crackling fire, snow beginning to fall gently outside the cabin window, Yancy felt a sense of peace that he had once thought lost to him forever. The grief would always be there, a soft shadow in the corners of his heart, but it no longer defined him. What defined him now was this love, this family, this second chance at happiness that had come to him, folded neatly in a letter from a woman wise enough to know that his heart was too good to die with her. Spring came early to Texas in 1877, bringing with it new beginnings and unexpected news. As the wildflowers began to carpet the hills around Silver Creek once more, Zoey confirmed what she had suspected for several weeks: she was expecting a child. The news was met with joy by both Yancy and Thomas, though the boy had practical questions about where the baby would sleep and whether it would interfere with his medical studies with Doc Miller. Zoey assured him that the new addition to their family would only enhance their lives, not diminish his place in it. As Zoey's condition became more evident, Yancy found himself filled with a mixture of excitement and protective concern. He reduced his travel with the stage line, taking on more local work, instead breaking horses, helping with spring roundups at neighboring ranches, and expanding the garden at their cabin to ensure plenty of fresh vegetables for his growing family. In June, as Zoey entered her 6th month of pregnancy, Yancy completed a project he had been working on in secret at the Miller cabin, a cradle lovingly crafted from oak and cedar, with intricate carvings along the sides depicting the Texas landscape that was now truly home. "It's beautiful," Zoey breathed as he presented it to her, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "You've been planning this for months, haven't you?" Yancy nodded, a hint of color rising in his cheeks. "I started it at Christmas, actually, just a feeling I had." Thomas examined the cradle critically, testing its rockers on the cabin floor. "It's sturdy," he pronounced, as if he were Doc Miller evaluating a patient. "The baby will like it." "I hope so," Yancy said, placing a hand gently on Zoey's rounded belly. As if in response, the child within kicked vigorously, bringing smiles to both parents' faces. Late summer brought sweltering heat and the final weeks of waiting. Zoey, despite her discomfort, continued to manage their household with characteristic efficiency, though she agreed to Thomas's insistence that she rest more frequently. The boy had appointed himself her personal physician, gravely checking her pulse and asking about her symptoms with all the seriousness of his mentor, much to Yancy and Zoey's amusement. On a scorching August afternoon, as Yancy was repairing a fence line near the edge of their property, Thomas came running across the field, his face flushed with excitement and urgency. Pa, come quick, the baby's coming." Yancy dropped his tools without a second thought and raced back to the cabin, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Inside, he found Zoey pacing slowly around the main room, one hand pressed to the small of her back. "Don't look so terrified," she said with a small smile despite the pain evident in her eyes. "Women have been doing this since Eve." "Thomas has gone for Doc Miller," Yancy said, moving to her side to support her as another contraction visibly gripped her. "What can I do?" "Just stay with me," Zoey replied, her hand finding his and squeezing tightly. "That's all I need right now." The labor progressed steadily through the afternoon and into the evening, with Doc Miller arriving to provide skilled assistance and reassurance. Thomas was sent to Sally's with a message about the impending birth, and the saloon keeper arrived shortly afterward with clean linens and a bottle of her best whiskey for medicinal purposes. As midnight approached, Zoey's labor intensified. Yancy stayed by her side throughout, his admiration for her strength growing with each passing hour. Finally, just as the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, a new cry joined the sounds of the awakening day, the lusty wail of their child entering the world. "A son," Doc Miller announced, placing the squalling infant on Zoey's chest after quickly cleaning and swaddling him. "A fine, healthy boy." Yancy stared in wonder at the tiny face, already showing signs of Zoey in the shape of his nose and chin. A powerful wave of love swept through him, as strong as what he had felt for Thomas from the beginning, but different. This was a love mingled with awe at having participated in the creation of this new life. "He's perfect," he whispered, gently touching the baby's cheek with one finger. "Absolutely perfect." Zoey smiled up at him, exhausted but radiant. "What shall we name him?" They had discussed names during the pregnancy but had never settled on a final choice. Now, looking at his son's face, Yancy knew with certainty what felt right. "If you agree," he said softly, "I'd like to name him James. James Zachariah Keller, after both the ones we loved and lost." Tears welled in Zoey's eyes as she nodded. "It's perfect," she said, echoing his words. "A way to honor the past while celebrating our future." Thomas, who had been allowed back into the cabin once the baby was safely delivered, approached the bed cautiously, his eyes wide with curiosity and a hint of uncertainty. "Would you like to meet your brother?" Zoey asked, shifting slightly to give him a better view of the infant. Thomas nodded solemnly. Is he really my brother, even though we don't share blood?" "Family isn't always about blood, son," Yancy said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "It's about love and choice and commitment. You're as much my son as little James here, and he's as much your brother as if you shared the same parents from birth." The boy considered this for a moment, then nodded again, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I'll teach him everything I know," he promised. "When he's bigger, I mean." Right now, he doesn't look like he can do much except cry and sleep." The adults laughed, the joyful sound filling the cabin as the sun rose fully on their first day as a family of 4. The years that followed were filled with the ordinary joys and challenges of family life, James's first steps and words, Thomas's growing expertise in medicine under Doc Miller's tutelage, the daily rhythms of work and play that defined their existence in Silver Creek. The town itself experienced a modest resurgence as cattle operations in the surrounding area grew, bringing new families and businesses to replace those lost when the mine closed. Yancy, drawing on his experience as a rancher, was often consulted by newcomers seeking advice on establishing their herds in the local terrain. In 1879, when James was 2 and Thomas 14, Zoey gave birth to their third child, a daughter they named Rose, whose arrival completed their family in ways they hadn't known were lacking. With her mother's green eyes and her father's determined chin, she quickly established herself as a force to be reckoned with, keeping pace with her brothers despite the age differences. As the children grew, so too did the legends of how their parents had found each other. The story of the letter, carefully folded by a dying woman for her husband's trembling hands, became a family treasure, told and retold on special occasions. Thomas, now studying medicine formally in San Antonio but returning home frequently, particularly enjoyed sharing the tale with his young siblings, embellishing it slightly more with each telling until Zoey would laughingly correct his more creative additions. In the spring of 1885, as Yancy approached his 44th birthday and James neared his 8th, a letter arrived from Austin, an offer to purchase a significant tract of land adjacent to their property for a price that would secure their financial future and provide educational funds for all 3 children. "What do you think?" Yancy asked Zoey as they sat on their porch one evening after the children were in bed. "It's a good offer, more than fair," Zoey considered, her fingers absently twisting the silver ring he had given her 10 years before. "The money would be welcome," she acknowledged. "Thomas's medical studies aren't cheap, and Rose and James will need education too. But it's not about the money," Yancy finished for her, understanding perfectly. "It's about what we've built here, the life we've made." She nodded, leaning against his shoulder as they looked out over the land that had been the backdrop for their unexpected love story. "I never thought I'd find happiness again after James died," she said softly, "and I know you felt the same after losing Zadie. Yet here we are with 3 beautiful children and a home filled with love." Yancy wrapped his arm around her, drawing her closer. "So we stay," he said simply. "We'll find another way to manage the expenses." "We stay," Zoey agreed, tilting her face up for his kiss. "This is where we found each other. This is home." Later that night, as Zoey slept peacefully beside him, Yancy rose quietly and moved to the small desk in the corner of their bedroom. From a locked drawer, he withdrew a worn piece of parchment, Zadie's letter, preserved now in a protective sleeve of oilcloth to prevent further deterioration. He didn't need to unfold it to know the words by heart, but there was something comforting in the ritual of holding this tangible connection to his first love, this bridge that had led him to his second. In the soft light of the lamp, he could make out the careful creases, still visible after all these years, creases made by loving hands for trembling fingers. "Thank you," he whispered to the memory of the woman who had loved him enough to send him searching for a new life. "For everything." As he carefully returned the letter to its place, Yancy felt the familiar sense of peace that had become the foundation of his days. The grief had transformed over the years into something gentler, a bittersweet memory that could coexist with his profound happiness in the present. Outside the window, the Texas night was alive with stars, each one a bright point of possibility in the vastness of the sky. Yancy Keller, once broken by loss, now stood whole at the center of a family created from the ashes of 2 great sorrows. And somewhere, he liked to think, Zadie was smiling her approval, knowing that her final gift, a carefully folded letter, had led to a love story neither of them could have imagined.